Most people think the law of assumption is about wanting something badly enough. That's the quiet mistake, because the moment you want, you've already assumed you don't have it. Neville Goddard wasn't teaching hope or belief or visualization as motivation. He was pointing to something far more uncomfortable, the idea that your life is already obeying assumptions you never consciously chose. And until you see how that mechanism actually works, nothing you try will ever stick. Most people believe their life is shaped by the big decisions they remember making, choosing a career, ending a relationship, taking a risk. But those moments are just the surface. What actually drives outcomes happens long before choice ever shows up. Every day, you move through the world carrying quiet assumptions about who you are, what's possible, and what usually happens to someone like you. You don't announce them. You don't consciously defend them. You simply act from them, and reality responds accordingly. Two people can want the same result, take similar actions, and live very different lives. Not because of effort, but because of the state they're operating from. One expects resistance, the other expects alignment. Neither expectation feels like a belief. It feels like common sense. That's the invisible driver, not desire, not discipline, but identity-level assumption. You don't attract what you want. You drift toward what feels normal to you. And until that normal changes, repeating techniques or affirmations only creates friction, because the world isn't responding to what you say you want. It's responding to who you're being when no one is watching. Once you see that, the question stops being, how do I manifest? And becomes something far more precise. What am I already assuming that's quietly steering everything? Neville Goddard never presented his ideas as motivation or self-help. He wasn't trying to inspire hope. He was trying to explain a mechanism. Born in the early 20th century, Neville didn't frame assumption as a mindset trick or a positive attitude. He framed it as identity in motion. According to him, the world doesn't rearrange itself because you want something. It rearranges itself when your inner state changes, when what you expect, tolerate, and emotionally accept shifts beneath the surface. This is where many people misunderstand his work. They hear phrases like, assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and interpret it as pretending, as fantasy, as optimism. But Neville was pointing to something far more subtle. He observed that people are always assuming, even when they think they're being realistic. They assume how others will treat them. They assume what effort leads to disappointment. They assume what success costs. These assumptions don't feel like beliefs. They feel like facts, and over time they harden into identity. Neville's core insight was this: you don't change your life by forcing new outcomes. You change it by occupying a new state and letting behavior, perception, and opportunity reorganize around it. That's why his work unsettles people, because it removes the comfort of blaming circumstance. If assumption creates experience, then neutrality doesn't exist. You're always living from something. The question is whether that state was chosen or inherited without your awareness. And once you understand that, the law of assumption stops sounding mystical and starts sounding uncomfortably practical. The law of assumption is often misunderstood because it gets grouped with wishful thinking. But the two couldn't be more different. Wishful thinking is passive. It imagines change while staying rooted in the same identity. It says, I hope things work out, while emotionally preparing for disappointment. Assumption works in the opposite direction. An assumption is not something you repeat. It's something you live from. It's the quiet sense of what's normal for you, what you expect to happen when you try, what kind of response you subconsciously anticipate from life. That's why assumptions are powerful. They don't require effort. They guide behavior automatically. If you assume opportunities are rare, you hesitate. If you assume relationships are unstable, you brace for loss. If you assume success comes with pressure or sacrifice, you sabotage ease. None of this feels dramatic. It feels reasonable, and that's the trap. The law of assumption doesn't say you get what you think about most. It says you experience what aligns with your default state of being. That's why simply wanting change doesn't work. Desire alone doesn't override identity. To assume something is to internally accept it as true now, not emotionally celebrate it, not obsess over it, but treat it as a lived fact. When that happens, your decisions subtly shift. Your perception filters differently. You notice openings you would have ignored. You respond instead of react. Reality doesn't change all at once. It reorganizes. So the law of assumption isn't about believing harder. It's about recognizing the state you're already in and understanding that staying there is a choice, even if it doesn't feel like one. Once that clicks, the question stops being whether the law works. The real question becomes, what am I currently assuming is true, and how long have I been living from it? Imagination is often dismissed as fantasy, something separate from real life, but in practice, imagination is the lens through which reality is interpreted. You never experience the world directly. You experience it through meaning. Two people can encounter the same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions, emotions, and next moves. Not because the situation was different, but because the inner image they carried into it was. That inner image is imagination at work. Imagination quietly sets expectations. It previews outcomes before they happen. It fills in gaps before evidence appears. And the body responds to those previews as if they're real. If you imagine failure as familiar, you tighten. If you imagine rejection as likely, you hold back. If you imagine success as temporary or costly, you never fully settle into it. This isn't mystical, it's functional. Imagination conditions your nervous system, your attention, and your choices. Over time, those choices compound into patterns, and those patterns look like fate. Neville understood this deeply. He saw imagination not as escape, but as rehearsal, a place where identity is practiced before it's expressed. That's why imagination shapes experience, not because thoughts magically create outcomes, but because the inner picture determines what feels safe, possible, and appropriate for you. You don't move toward what you desire. You move toward what feels familiar, and imagination is where familiarity is built. Change the inner image, and behavior follows without force, which leads to a critical shift in perspective. Because if imagination sets the stage, then the real work isn't chasing outcomes. It's learning how to live from the ending you want, before the world gives you permission. Living from the end doesn't mean pretending everything is perfect. It means allowing your internal state to settle into the after instead of waiting for proof. Most people live from anticipation. They're mentally positioned just before the thing happens, just before the breakthrough, just before things finally change. That posture creates tension. Living from the end removes that tension by shifting identity first. When something is truly done, you stop checking on it. You don't rehearse conversations about it. You don't emotionally negotiate with it. You simply move forward as someone for whom that outcome is normal. That's what Neville meant by the end. It's not a fantasy scene. It's an internal conclusion. From that state, behavior changes naturally. You speak differently. You choose differently. You tolerate less friction, not because you're trying to attract anything, but because your sense of self has already updated. This is why living from the end feels uncomfortable at first. It asks you to release the emotional habits tied to wanting. Wanting keeps the old identity alive. Completion dissolves it. And that's where resistance shows up. The mind protests. It asks for evidence. It warns you not to get ahead of yourself. But the end isn't arrogance. It's coherence. It's aligning your internal posture with the version of you that already knows how this resolves. And once that alignment stabilizes, the outside world doesn't need to be forced. It adjusts, slowly, quietly, often in ways that don't look dramatic at all. Which brings us to the most overlooked part of the process, the signal that tells your system whether an assumption is real or just imagined. Feeling isn't emotion in the dramatic sense. It's tone. It's the background signal your system broadcasts when nothing is happening. You can think positive thoughts and still feel unsettled. You can visualize success and still feel like you're waiting for permission. That's because feeling reveals what you've actually accepted as true. Neville called this the secret for a reason. Feeling is what stabilizes an assumption. Without it, ideas stay hypothetical. When something is real to you, your body knows, your breathing changes, your urgency drops, your attention softens. That's the signal. If an assumption creates tension, it hasn't landed yet. If it creates calm, it's integrating. This is why forcing emotion doesn't work. Excitement fades, intensity collapses, but settled certainty persists. The feeling of the wish fulfilled isn't joy or adrenaline. It's relief. It's neutrality. It's the absence of internal negotiation. When you assume something deeply, you stop proving it. You stop explaining it to yourself. You stop rehearsing how it might happen. That quiet is the signal life responds to. Because reality doesn't reorganize around what you desire. It reorganizes around what you've normalized emotionally. Once a state feels ordinary, it stops being resisted. And what isn't resisted tends to move. This is why so many people feel stuck even while doing the work. Their thoughts are forward, but their emotional baseline is still rooted in lack. The moment that baseline shifts, even slightly, behavior follows. Timing changes and opportunities appear without announcement. Not because you tried harder, but because your system stopped asking if. And once that happens, a new question quietly takes over. What are the conversations you're having with yourself that keep reinforcing the old state? Most assumptions are reinforced through conversation, not with other people, with yourself. There's a constant internal dialogue running in the background of your day. It comments, it predicts, it explains why things happened the way they did. And over time, that dialogue becomes your identity's voice. If that voice expects effort to go unnoticed, you hesitate to show up fully. If it assumes people eventually disappoint you, you keep emotional distance without realizing why. If it frames success as fragile, you prepare for loss, even in moments of progress. These conversations don't sound negative. They sound reasonable. That's why they're powerful. Neville paid close attention to this. He observed that people don't live from their goals. They live from the stories they quietly repeat about themselves. Change the story, and the state shifts. This doesn't require policing every thought. It requires awareness of tone. Listen for what your inner voice assumes will happen, not what it hopes for, what it casually predicts. Those predictions shape posture. Posture shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. When the inner dialogue changes, effort decreases. You don't have to push yourself into new actions. You find yourself responding differently without trying. That's when assumption becomes embodied. Not because you convinced yourself of something new, but because the old narrative lost authority, and once that authority weakens, resistance appears. Not from the world, but from the part of you that was built around the old state, which is why the next phase isn't about positivity. It's about understanding why consistency feels difficult right before change stabilizes. Not reversal, delay. This is where most people lose confidence. They assume something isn't working because the outer world hasn't caught up yet. But in reality, delay is often a sign that identity is reorganizing faster than circumstances. The mind doesn't like that gap. It looks for familiar evidence. It tests. It reverts to old explanations to regain stability. Neville understood this phase well. He warned that persistence isn't about forcing belief. It's about remaining loyal to a state, even when the environment hasn't adjusted. Consistency doesn't mean repetition. It means non-reactivity. The moment you stop emotionally negotiating with appearances, the assumption gains ground. When you don't rush to correct, explain, or defend your position, the old pattern loses fuel. This is why impatience can undo progress. It pulls attention back to the former identity, the one that measures worth by external confirmation. Time in this context isn't an obstacle, it's a buffer. It allows internal alignment to stabilize before new patterns express fully. The people who succeed with assumption aren't more optimistic. They're quieter internally. They stop asking, "Is this working?" and start moving as if the question no longer applies. That shift doesn't feel dramatic. It feels boring. But boredom is often a sign that the nervous system has accepted a new normal. And once something is normal, it doesn't need reinforcement. Which leads to the final realization: assumption isn't about control, it's about authorship. At its core, the law of assumption isn't about getting what you want. It's about taking responsibility for the state you live from. Every life follows a narrative. Most people inherit theirs unconsciously, from family, culture, past experience, and emotional conditioning. They don't choose the story, they simply act it out. Assumption is the moment authorship begins. Not through force, not through affirmation, but through quiet ownership of identity. When you assume a state, you stop arguing with reality. You stop asking for permission to be different. You move as someone who already knows how this version of life unfolds. That doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. You respond instead of react. You choose without overthinking. You let go of outcomes that no longer match who you are. And slowly, without announcement, the world reorganizes around that posture. Not because the universe was convinced, but because you were. This is why the law of assumption feels confronting. It removes the illusion of neutrality. It suggests you've been participating all along. Every delay, every pattern, every repeated outcome, none of it was random. It was consistent. And consistency can be changed, not by fighting the old story, but by stepping into the one that already knows how this ends. That's the quiet authority of choice. No pressure, no waiting, no chasing, just alignment.